He pressed the camera button and, unknowingly, recorded his own death. 4 photos taken in sequence, 4 frozen moments that shouldn't exist, no logical explanation, and a disturbing detail that the police have never been able to answer to this day. The Peak District in England is known for its tranquil trails, green hills, and a silence that usually calms anyone. But there is a specific stretch that doesn't appear in tourist guides, isn't recommended by locals, and provokes a strange feeling in those who pass by, as if something were always one step behind, observing every movement. The man was walking alone that day, experienced, equipped, showing no signs of disorientation, someone who had already done more dangerous trails and who didn't usually make basic mistakes, and yet he chose a secondary path that few use and almost no one photographs. His name was never officially released. In the records, he appears only as the Hiker, a decision made to protect his family, but which ended up creating even more mystery, because erasing the name didn't erase what was found. When rescue teams arrived at the scene hours after the disappearance was reported, they found the body in an open area with no clear signs of attack, no witnesses, and no immediate explanations. But the camera attached to the backpack strap changed everything. Inside were 4 photos taken minutes before the death, images that not only recorded the environment but seemed to anticipate exactly what was about to happen, as if someone or something knew the ending before it even happened. The first image seems harmless at first glance, a common framing of a trail, the cloudy sky, the narrow path ahead, and the camera's digital clock showing 2:17 p.m. But when experts enlarged the photo, they noticed something wrong, a shadow cast on the ground that did not correspond to the angle of the sun at that time, and that seemed to belong to someone who was not in the frame. The second photo was taken exactly 2 minutes later, the framing more unstable, as if the camera had been triggered hastily, showing part of the vegetation and the beginning of a slope, and in the background, almost imperceptible, a dark shape among the trees, too large to be a common animal and too still to be just a play of light. The third image is the one that most bothered the investigators because it shows no landscape at all, only the face of the hiker himself reflected in the lens glass, eyes wide, jaw tense, an expression of real fear, the kind that cannot be faked, and behind him, reflected in a blurred way, something that shouldn't be there, tall, indistinct, and too close. The fourth and final photo was taken at 2:23 p.m., 6 minutes after the first, and shows the ground, rocks, leaves, and the edge of a slope, as if the camera had been triggered at the exact moment he lost his balance. But the most disturbing detail is not the fall itself, but the fact that the photo was taken from an angle that suggests the camera was no longer attached to his body. When the police tried to reconstruct the sequence, they realized there wasn't enough time for him to have stopped, manually positioned the camera, and then fallen. The interval between the shots simply doesn't match normal human movement. It was at this point that the case ceased to be treated as a simple trail accident and began to be internally classified as an unexplained event, a rare, uncomfortable category that usually never comes to the public's attention. After the photos surfaced, investigators began cross-referencing the exact location of the death with old accounts from hikers, and that's when they realized that this specific stretch of the Peak District had already appeared in informal records long before this case, always described with the same words: excessive silence, momentary loss of sense of time, and the constant feeling of being followed without ever seeing anyone. Local guides admitted, outside of official records, that they avoided passing through there at dusk because compasses often failed, cell phones abruptly lost signal, and people reported hearing footsteps that mimicked their own footsteps with an almost perfect delay. One hiker interviewed months later recounted that while crossing the area, he had the clear impression that the path had been artificially lengthened, as if the trail led nowhere, forcing him to walk more than 40 minutes beyond what was planned until he found a recognizable point on the map again. Another account,
filed away years earlier and practically forgotten, described an amateur photographer who returned home with dozens of automatically taken images, all showing the same scenery but with slight variations, as if the environment were slowly rearranging itself with each shot. The detail that most caught the investigators' attention was that these accounts increased dramatically in number whenever someone walked alone, never in groups, never accompanied, as if the place reacted differently to the isolated presence. When old maps were analyzed, it was discovered that the trail did not officially exist before the 1950s, but the area already appeared in older documents marked only as an unstable zone, a vague term that does not refer to landslides or common geological hazards. A retired former park employee stated in an unofficial interview that the section had been reopened after the war without complete studies because no one could explain exactly what was wrong there, only that something made people get lost even knowing exactly where they were. It was at this point that the investigation shifted focus, moving away from simply explaining the hiker's death and towards trying to understand if the location itself might have influenced each decision, each step, and perhaps each photo taken by that camera. The official report pointed to an accidental fall as the cause of death, a diagnosis that was too hasty for a case full of strange variables. Although the body showed fractures consistent with impact, the position in which it was found did not correspond to the type of unevenness recorded in the fourth photo. Technicians noted that he did not fall face first or backwards, but sideways, as if he'd been pushed or tried to move away from something at the last moment, something the report avoided explicitly stating. The camera underwent detailed forensic examination, and it was confirmed that there were no mechanical failures, no programmed automatic triggering, and no defect in the motion sensor, which eliminates the hypothesis of accidental or random recordings. The most unsettling aspect arose when the camera's internal clocks were cross-referenced with meteorological data because the brightness level in the photos didn't match the recorded time, as if the images had been captured at a different time interval than the clock indicated. A forensic photography expert, speaking anonymously, stated that there seemed to be temporal compression between the records, as if the 6 minutes between the first and last photo didn't represent 6 real minutes of experience for the person present. The other detail ignored publicly was that the camera remained active after the estimated time of death, registering micro-power spikes as if it were being handled or moved, even though the body was already motionless. This data appeared in the device's internal records, but is not included in the final report delivered to the family, being classified as irrelevant to the cause of death. One technician even questioned why the camera showed micro-focus adjustments after the fall, something that only occurs when there is a variation in distance between the lens and the object, but this observation was dismissed due to a lack of practical explanation. When all these points were brought together, it became clear to some of the team that the problem wasn't just understanding how he died, but answering who or what was still interacting with that camera when he could no longer do so. When the camera was returned to the lab for further analysis, technicians discovered something that had never appeared in press conferences or official documents. Besides the 4 known photos, there were fragments of corrupted files, pieces of images that wouldn't fully open, but which clearly indicated that the memory card had attempted to record more after the 4th photo. These fragments had no visible thumbnails, only incomplete code and broken metadata, as if the recording process had been repeatedly interrupted, not due to a technical failure, but due to something external interfering with the normal functioning of the device. One of the technicians managed to partially reconstruct one of these files, revealing a blurred, extremely grainy image where the hiker was not visible, only the empty path, exactly from the same point as the first photo, as if someone had returned to the beginning of the trail holding the camera. The most disturbing detail was the internal time of this reconstructed file, marking almost 40 minutes after the official time of death, an interval in which no one should have been using that equipment. Another fragment showed only sky and vegetation, but with an impossible tilt for a camera lying on the ground, suggesting that it was picked up again at some point. These data led investigators to quietly consider that the fourth photo might not be the end of the sequence, but only the last complete recording before something interrupted the normal recording process. A forensic analyst even stated that the pattern of file corruption did not correspond to physical impact, water, or electrical failure, but to repeated interruptions, as if the camera were being turned on and off at irregular intervals. Most unsettlingly, at the end of the memory card, there was enough free space for dozens of additional photos, proving that the recording did not stop due to lack of capacity. When these points were presented internally, the recommendation was clear: the material should not be released because it would raise more questions than any possible answers. Thus, the case began to be treated not just as an
After the corrupted files were identified, the investigation entered a phase that was never officially recorded because technicians and authorities decided to return to the site trying to reproduce the exact conditions of the day of the death. They used the same camera model, set the same internal clock, walked the trail at the same time of day, and even simulated pauses similar to those the hiker would have taken, but nothing explained the shadows, the impossible angles, or the out-of-time recordings. In one attempt, an investigator reported that the camera triggered on its own while attached to the vest, without programming, without physical contact, and without any abrupt change in light, an event that was treated as an isolated failure and immediately removed from the report. Another detail began to repeat itself among the participants in these reproductions, a feeling of loss of continuity, as if small lapses in memory arose when crossing a certain point on the trail, forcing them to check watches and maps with abnormal frequency. One of the agents stated that he had the distinct impression of having passed through that section minutes before, although the GPS showed constant progress, as if the space were subtly, almost imperceptibly, folding. Audio recordings made during the tests captured low noises, similar to footsteps out of sync with the group's movements, but these sounds were officially attributed to wind and vegetation. What bothered those involved most was realizing that all the strange events only happened when someone moved a few meters away from the group, never when they remained together, reinforcing the idea that the location reacted differently to isolated presence. After 3 days of frustrated attempts and uncomfortable reports, the decision was made unofficially. No further reproductions would be carried out at that specific point. The location was not closed off, did not receive warning signs, and was not removed from maps. It was simply discreetly avoided by internal teams, as if ignoring it was the only way to prevent it from happening again. When investigators reviewed the hiker's last personal logs, they found something that had initially gone unnoticed because it didn't seem relevant. Small notes made on his cell phone during the hike, simple observations about the weather, terrain, and travel time, until one sentence stood out completely from the rest: "The path isn't behaving as it should." This note was made less than 20 minutes before the first photo, suggesting that he had already noticed something wrong long before the final moment. Another unsettling detail emerged when cross-referencing this case with old records of disappearances in the region, because several accounts mentioned exactly the same feeling described in the notes: the idea that the space seemed to respond, delay, or confuse those hiking alone. In 2 of these cases, personal belongings were found intact on open trails, positioned in an orderly fashion, as if they had been intentionally placed there after the disappearance. An investigator noted that whenever there was photographic evidence in these old cases, the images showed similar framing patterns: empty trails, slightly misaligned angles, and shadows that did not correspond to the real environment. The most disturbing pattern, however, was in the timing, because almost all the disappearances occurred within short windows, always in the middle of the afternoon, never early in the morning, never at night, as if there were a specific interval in which the place became unstable. The hypothesis raised internally was that the hiker noticed this pattern too late and tried to record what was happening in the only way possible, using the camera as proof of something he couldn't explain in words.
The 4 photos, then, ceased to be seen merely as accidental records and began to be interpreted as a conscious sequence, almost a warning, a desperate attempt to show that he was not alone, even when everything around him seemed empty. It was at this point that part of the team reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Perhaps those images showed not only the hiker's death, but the exact moment when he realized that there was no longer any way to leave that trail in the same way he entered. Officially, the case of the hiker in the Peak District was closed as a tragic accident, a combination of uneven terrain, distraction, and bad luck. An explanation too simplistic for a set of evidence that never truly fit together. The 4 photos remain archived, rarely displayed in their entirety, and almost always accompanied by cropping, selective enlargements, or low resolution, as if someone were afraid of what might be perceived when viewed without filters. The section of the trail remains open to this day, without warning signs, without mention in tourist guides, and yet silently avoided by those who know the region better than the maps indicate. What makes this story truly unsettling is not the idea of something supernatural, but the possibility that there are places that don't function the same way as the rest of the world, spaces where time, perception, and human logic fail in a subtle, almost elegant way. If the hiker truly realized this before the end, then the photos were not an accident, but a warning left for those who came after, an attempt to show that relying solely on one's senses is not always enough. The question that remains is not how he died, but how many people have passed through that same spot, felt something strange, and moved on without looking back, without recording anything, without leaving any proof. Perhaps the reason why this case is never discussed publicly is too simple. Admitting that we don't fully understand certain places is admitting that not every path was made to be traversed. So, if one day you are walking alone, feel that time has slowed down, that the silence has become too heavy, and that the path ahead seems slightly different than it should, perhaps the best decision is not to take a picture, but to turn back immediately. Because some records are not meant to be seen. They only serve to prove that someone tried to warn you.